Hello and thanks for joining us for a demonstration of PRISM Capture. Before we get into the demonstration, let's have a look at what PRISM Capture is. It's an advanced data capture software solution to automatically and intelligently extract data from scanned and electronic documents. It will do this and then automatically process that extracted data and documents using the integrated workflow. PRISM Capture is server-based. For those with lower volume requirements or perhaps not having a server available, the same advanced data extraction capability is available as an add-on module with the companion product PRISM WorkPath. In fact, PRISM WorkPath also has a reviewer screen where operators may carry out verification and correction for documents processed by PRISM Capture. It's typically used for extracting data from documents like sales orders, delivery notes, invoices, statements, HR documents, and many other department, industry, and even organization specific forms and documents. Once the data is extracted, then it's output to various different sources, which can include accounting, ERP, and other applications. The key differentials with PRISM Capture are that it's lower cost than alternatives that might be considered, and it's much easier to use and configure. So let's take a look at how it works. Single or batch documents are received from a number of different import sources which are defined here. These include options for network folders, commonly known as watch folders or hot folders, FTP, printer, or email, and even data file. So that's extracting data from files such as CSV, XML, and then using that data for various different tasks. In this case, you can see that we've got processes set up for delivery notes, sales orders, and purchase invoices. If we have a look at the properties of a particular process, then you can see that they link to a template set. We can define the watch folder for this case, and we can also narrow down the different file types that we wish to process. There are a range of other options, including options to clean up the image so that it's better ready for processing. We'll come to some of the other options later. For now though, let's run that process through and see what happens. So we have our sample delivery files, which include various information on the document, including the barcode containing the delivery note number, and that's what we're going to read in this case. So if we scan some of those documents in to our hot folder, what we should see is that they will start to process, and that should happen relatively quickly. Once processed, we're automatically outputting the scanned file and the data file that goes with it with the extracted data. Let's create a new template set and call it delivery 2. We'll add a template into that template set called delivery notes and OK that. We can then go in and edit this template set. Once we've got our sample file, we can zoom in to look at the information. And we also have the ability to create our zones, which is what we're going to do next. So we'll add a zone around the barcode value that we want. If we double click on the zone, we get the option to give it a name. So let's call it delivery note number. And we can choose the zone type. There are a number of different zone types for text and barcodes, whether the zone moves around on the page based on trigger text and all sorts of other information. We have the ability to extract data from fillable PDF forms. There's also smart zones, which are very intelligent zones and give you a lot of powerful capability, and we'll look at those later on. In this case, we want a barcode zone. We can define the types of barcode that we want if we know it specifically, and you've got various other options. We can OK that, and then if we highlight here, we can see our name of our zone and the data that's going to be extracted. What we also might want to do is define when a document starts and finishes, and for each template you've got an action. So the normal action just means that it starts on page 1 and it will carry on until told otherwise, but there are various other options to include attachments, whether it's a cover sheet to extract the data from the cover sheet and then drop it, or whether you're going to skip it or end a document. In this case we'll leave it on normal, but what we're going to do is override the template action when we see a change in the barcode value. We're going to overwrite it to start a new document. Once we've got our data, we can look at the correction tab. The correction tab allows us to clean up the data. So for example, if we don't want any alpha characters in that output, what we can do is simply go strip non-digit, and that gets rid of the P on the end of the number. We can validate zones as well. In this case, if I leave the zone as not empty, that will validate correctly. But let's say, for example, we want it to say that it contains something like the letter P, then what we'll find now is that that zone turns orange because it's not validated correctly. But what we'll do is we'll leave it as not empty. Next, we need to define our output connectors. Output connectors can be to output the data and document to file, output to database, output to PRISM's own document management, and SharePoint as well. You can have multiple output connectors, as many as you like actually, and of different sorts. So for example, we can have our delivery notes output connector, but we could also have one for errors. Errors might be if we output in the document and there's no delivery note number, so we want to output it in a different way. If we were doing that, we would make that conditional, and we would add in a condition to use this particular output. In this case, we're going to keep it simple, and we will delete that output. Let's take a look at the configuration of the output. The first tab in the configuration is to configure the data and where you want it to go. So you can add all the zones as fields, and if you've got lots of zones, they'll all appear here. You can also add additional data fields. So let's do that. There's one output one called date and time. When we're outputting additional fields that aren't collected as zones, then we can choose text, or we can also do database lookups, which it can be very handy as well. If we go into our expression editor, then all we simply want is the current date and time. Let's verify that and check it's okay. It is. Okay that. In our data format, then we can choose what the data format's going to be. So we can do CSV like you saw earlier, or let's change that to XML. We've got a middle tab which is to preview the data, so you can see what it's going to look like in terms of the variables we're using, but in terms of the loaded in sample, we can actually see what data is being extracted for the sample and how it's going to look. For the file settings tab, we define where the file is going to go as well as the data file. So what we'll do is we'll output the file to a folder. Let's do that to the desktop. We also get a chance to rename the file. And what we want to do is rename that as the delivery note number. We can choose to output the file only, or only output the data file if we so wish. And we can also choose to have a different folder path for the data file and the file name, or keep it the same. We'll keep it the same in this instance. Let's apply that and save it. And what we'll do here is we'll change our process currently running for delivery notes to point to our new data set. So if we edit the input process and choose delivery notes 2, what we should find now is that when we process the data, it's going to go to our new destination. So let's throw a few through. Once the processing is finished, then we have a PDF for each of the delivery notes that we put through, as well as an XML file to correspond with that. Let's now take a look at our template set for the delivery notes that we used before. Because if you may remember them, when we output that file, we also had the customer name that went with it. So there are two options. One is that we could have drawn a zone on the page and extracted the name of the customer from the actual document. But given it's our delivery note, and we know that the data is in a database against the delivery note number, We can actually do a database lookup as part of the process, and that's what happened here. We carried out an ODBC database lookup to pull back the name of the customer and then use that in the output file settings. So we had an underscore and then the name of the customer. So let's take a look at line items now. We have a line item process for each of our customer orders. If we open one of those up, what we see is that we've got more zones, but we've also got column zones to extract data from the various columns on the document. And if we zoom in on that, we see we have an anchor field, which is description, because if we're scanning in, then they could shift around on the page, but once we find the description, then the columns will always relate back to that description field. And when we're looking at the columns, then it will extract the data, and we can set various parameters for extracting the data from the columns. We can also use correction to get rid of things like blank spaces and blank lines that aren't needed in our output file. Clearly, in the case of column data, there's a lot more room for error. So that might be where we want to use the reviewer screen for operators to check and verify that the data is correct. In the case of delivery notes, then the documents went straight through. To prevent that from happening, then we can configure the input process accordingly. On the Options tab, there's a processing mode, and there are 4 options. One is to auto-commit the good zones. They're the zones that validate correctly. Or we can auto-commit everything. We can also review on a problem, or we can review on everything. In this case, we've got it set to review on everything. So even if it validates correctly, it's going to review. We can then click on reviewers and add in who the reviewers are. Those reviewers that have the work path will be able to review any documents that are put through this process. Now let's scan some documents. So we've scanned our files into the watch folder, and if we start the process, those files should start to process now. So with work path open on screen, then you can see that we've got the Capture Reviewer button. Simply press on that and we can open up the Capture Reviewer. We will see the 3 scanned documents that have come in, and then on the right hand side we will see the data that's been extracted from those documents. We can correct the data if we need to, or we can leave it as it is. In this case, everything is validated as green, so that means that it's okay. If we zoom in, then we can show you a feature which means that if you mouse over various text on there, you can simply just click and it will write that text into the document. Let's change that back again. Once that's done, then we can commit our data, and what we should see when that's completed is that the data will come up into our output folder, and here it is. Let's move on now and talk about smart fields. To do that, we're going to look at our default invoice template. We can see there that we've got a number of different fields for invoice number, invoice date, order number, net value, the VAT amount, total, supplier name, and the VAT ID of the supplier. The various data being extracted off the page. If I take a look at one of those zones, we can see that it's configured as a smart zone. And effectively, a smart zone allows us to configure in lots of different text that might tell us where the invoice number is. For each line of trigger text, then you can configure various options. So you can tell it, for example, where to look once it's found a triggered text, either right or below, or there's a number of different other options too. You can also be more specific about the data type that it's looking for, and it can pass over data types that aren't relevant. So if it finds an address block and you're looking for an invoice number, it obviously knows that's not correct. In this case, for invoice number, you'd perhaps choose item number. We can carry out correction like we've seen before, or we can use validation. And there's also a field called post-process validation, which checks what the operators put in the reviewer screen when they're correcting the data. So as an example of that, then we can click on the amount due field, and on the post-processing validation tab for that, then we've got amount due should equal the net value plus the tax value. Let's take a look at processing some of the supplier invoices now. So we've got our supplier invoices in our hot folder again, and we're going to start the process. When that's completed, we'll be able to go into the reviewer and we'll check the extracted data for those invoices. There is also a reviewer screen available from within the Capture server, which is very handy for testing. You can see that it's processed 3 of those invoices now, but if we press the refresh button, we will see the next one too. And if I press on one of the invoices, the invoice data is returned. In the case of this one, then you can see that all the invoice data has been extracted correctly. So we can simply commit the data set. In the case of our Zoom invoice though, we can see that it hasn't actually found the supplier name. And the problem with that, the problem there is that there is no supplier telephone number or VAT number on the document which we're using to actually go to a database and bring back the name of the supplier. So in that case it might be that we need to create a variant. Before we create a variant, we can also see that the tax value is not correct. In this case it's because there is no tax value on the invoice, so we just simply enter in zeros there. Let's close the reviewer and go into the template manager. In the template manager, we have the option to load in different sample documents. I have now loaded in the Zoom sample document. What we need to do is create a variant, and it's basically the problem is with the supplier name field because there is nothing on there. But if we look closely, zoom in on the document, then we could perhaps use something like the postcode as a quick example as to how to change that. We'll remove all of our triggers fields apart from one, and we can rename that San Jose. Okay, that. Now see that the supplier name has actually been found as the postcode. So what we now need to do is correct that. Now we could do a database lookup, and in our database we could put the postcode of the data that's been found. But in this case we don't really need to, because this template is only for Zoom invoices, so we can hard code it in. There are various ways to do that. One option is to do a search and replace. Once we've programmed in our search and replace, there are a couple of other things I would prefer to do before we do the search and replace. One is to remove spaces prior to doing the search and replace, and the other one is to remove the comma. So we do a search and replace for a comma and replace it with nothing, and that's now validated correctly. All we do now is a create variant. And apply that. We need to move our variant up higher, and we also need to make sure that that field there is a trigger field for the template. So we tick the template trigger box. Now if we've made our changes correctly, if we process that Zoom invoice again, the next time we come through it should actually correctly identify which template's been used. Let's go into the reviewer to see if that's been done correctly now. Okay, great, so that's now found that. Thank you for taking the time to watch this recording. Please contact us if you would like to trial the software, to discuss a general or particular requirement, or to learn more about creating processes, document management, and advanced workflows. We look forward to hearing from you.